Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Reason with Science. I'm your host Jitendra. Our guest today is Gina Rippon. She is a professor emeritus of cognitive neuroimaging at Aston Brain Center, Birmingham. Her research applies brain imaging techniques to study cognitive processes. I got to know her work from her book, which was published in 2019, The Gendered Brain, with an important subtitle, The New Neuroscience That Shatters the Myth of the Female Brain. So today we'll talk about her career as a scientist, her work on sex difference, and her views on women in society and STEM. So with that, I welcome Gina for today's conversation.
Hello, Jitendra. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, so let's start with an interesting thing that I noticed. So once I searched your name in the Google, of course there was your Wikipedia, your information, but then there was one question: is Gina a feminist? So let's start with that. Are you a feminist, and what are your views on feminism today?
Absolutely, I'm a feminist. I would have the classic academic caveat. I would be interested to know how you define feminist, because sometimes people have a different view of what being a feminist is and what the term feminist actually means. It's based on the idea that everybody should be given equal opportunities, if you like. It's not saying that everybody's the same as everybody else, but saying that everybody should be given equal access to the opportunities that the world has to offer. And addressing any areas where that is clearly not the case. And that can be a feminist way of doing science, for example, where you embed your hypothesis generating interpretation of your data in an understanding of what you're finding, the implications of your findings might have for these kind of equality and equity issues. And it can go beyond, obviously, into law and politics and finance, access to health, etc.
Yes, rightly said. We'll go more into that, of course, on your views on feminism and what your findings have shown us. But the first question is, so how was growing up in your case, and did you always aspire to be a neuroscientist?
Well, I grew up in an era where education for girls was very definitely not considered that important, and where there was assumption that girls had a different ending in their sex roles, etc. So there wasn't as big an emphasis on making sure that everybody had really good education. But there was a bigger emphasis on making sure that boys had good access to good education and less of an emphasis for girls. With respect to neuroscience, I'd always been really interested in brains for some reason, from a very early age. Apparently, I used to cut open my teddy bears' heads to see if they had brains. I'm not sure if that's a family myth of some kind. And I was originally going to do medicine to pursue that interest, and then got diverted into psychology because I realized actually I wasn't necessarily interested in the brain itself. I was interested in what the brain did and how it made people behave differently. So I went into neuroscience through psychology, but it was always with an emphasis on the role of the brain in human behavior.
Yes. And what about what sort of myths did you hear when you were studying or trying to be in the science?
Yeah, well, actually, about the time I was starting a sort of research career, there was very well established, they were actually metaphors for how the brain worked, and also for the fact that there was such a thing as a female brain and a male brain, and these were what the differences were, and they were characterized in particular ways. So there was a big emphasis at that stage on the idea of the right brain and the left brain. The fact that the left brain was responsible for logic and language and reason, and the right brain was creative and emotional, etc. Those are well established, in the textbooks that we were given as students, and the textbooks I then used as an academic myself. So So that was one of the myths. And the other myth was the myth of the male and female brain, which was kind of entangled with the right-left brain, because the idea was that females were much more emotional and therefore they must be much more driven by the right-hand side of their brains, whereas men were logical and rational and scientific, and therefore the left brain was dominant. So yes, lots of myths, within my academic career, which informed what we told our students and how we devised our research programs.
Yeah, I mean, of course, when you imagine that, being in that patriarch society, and of course, pursuing a career in science at that time, but all these myths, they didn't come like at that point, right? I mean, if not thousands, these myths are there for hundreds of years.
Well, I mean, the idea of the right and the male and the female brain started sort of at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, when the then scientists started studying the brain, or actually more likely theorizing about the brain, because at that point you couldn't actually look at an intact living human brain in an intact living human. You could see what happened when people had some kind of disease or damage, which you could pinpoint in a part of the brain, or you could assume that it was something to do with the size of the brain, in which case you could look at empty skulls and fill them with birdseed and weigh the birdseed and hypothesize about what the size of the brain might have meant. Or you could eventually, with microscopes and things, look at different structures. So emerging at that stage was one of the first questions that the then neuroscientists looked at, was working backwards from the status quo. So they looked at society as it was then configured. Women clearly had a very inferior position in society, because they did. And therefore they worked backwards from that and said, we need to prove why women's brains are inferior. So there wasn't a question about whether or not there were male or female brains. It was assumed that, of course, women had different brains from men. And it must be something to do with the size of the brain, or the relationship between the size of the brain and the size of the body, or a whole range of, the bumps on the head, or the angles of your earlobe to your forehead, or something like that. So those kind of myths, the fact that there were different brains, and initially that the female brain was inferior, and that actually intersected with lots of other research emerging at the time. So intersected with research into class and race as well. The assumption that other races, capital O, capital R, must have different brains, which made them inferior, because again, that was part of the research, hunt the difference agenda. The right-left brain emerged later with respect to once people, once medicine had advanced sufficiently that people who had suffered brain injury survived, you could then see what kind of faculties they'd lost. And for example, very early idea was that people who'd suffered injury, parts of the left side of the brain, were characterized by very strange, either complete loss of language or difficulty with particular aspects of language. So clearly the left side of the brain did language in a kind of understandable logic. So I guess those kind of theories had been around for a long time. And then we started to get the brain organization theory, looking at testosterone levels, once it was clear that human fetuses started out the same, and then they diverged along different pathways driven by different exposure to testosterone. There was an assumption that testosterone also had a role not only on producing anatomical differences, but had a role in producing, organizing the brain differently. So, they've been emerging over the last a couple of hundred years, I suppose.
Yeah, so on one side, science is an enterprise to ask these deeper questions about nature of reality, etc. On the other side, when we can see that once science starts with biases, what it can lead to. I mean, these are certain examples that you gave.
Yeah, I mean, I think I quote in the book one Gustave Le Bon, who was very vocal in early brain research, who effectively says, women are evolutionarily inferior to men, more like animals and children. And occasionally there were bright females, but they were so rare, they were like a gorilla with two heads. So, if you've got the scientist asking those kind of questions, who was clearly slightly less than objective with respect to the questions he was asking, yes, bias gets established. And I think that's one of the difficulties. It's a fine line to tread, because science presents itself as hugely objective, separating itself from any kind of subjective opinion or bias. And then you start looking at the neuroscience of sex and gender, and you say, well, not necessarily consciously fitting in with the theories of the time, the questions you were asking were biased. I mean, bearing in mind that Charles Darwin himself was an out-and-out misogynist with his views on the inferiority of women. So, he was just talking about what people believed at the time.
Exactly. It was unbelievable when I read that a scientist who changed the perspective of biology. I mean, Dobzhansky said that nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution.
And interesting also that obviously he could not have come to the conclusion he did without having an inquiring mind. Yet he never challenged the perspective of women in society, and his personal views on why he got married, because he thought a woman might be a better companion than a dog, kind of sort of reflects attitudes towards women at the time.
Exactly. Yeah, I think then we should go in a bit more detail of these biases, which probably they may exist today. One of them is does size matter, which is related to corpus callosum in the brain.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, I talk about the size matters because in a way that's where it all started, because the early brain researchers thought it must be something to do with the size of the brain. So when they came up with the observation that on average, and that's something really important we ought to talk about, men's brains were about 5 ounces heavier than women's. That was the answer. That was why men were superior. They had a bigger brain. And then we get the story about sperm whales and elephants having bigger brains and not necessarily being hugely more intellectually gifted than the average human male. And so then people started looking at different structures. And one of the things that was observed was that there was reports of a thicker pathway, nerve cell pathway between the right and the left hemisphere being thicker in women. And the logic, the way in which that was interpreted was, well, we know women are more emotionally intelligent, better at perceiving emotion. We know that women suffer less damage to language capacity if they have left hemisphere damage. So perhaps language was represented in both sides of the brain. So then they said, oh, well, this thicker bridge, the corpus callosum joining the right and the left hemisphere, that must underpin why women were better at using emotional language, understanding emotional language, because the right and the left hemisphere were connected more efficiently. But that was, again, before anybody could say that's what having a thicker corpus callosum actually meant, because you couldn't at that point track nerve cell activity across the hemispheres. You just assumed that that's what you were measuring. But it also applies to all sorts of other aspects. They talk about the ratio of grey matter to white matter being different in males and females, about men having a bigger amygdala or bigger hippocampus, and that has underpinned the whole hunt the difference agenda. It's always been based on structures, the size of structures, with the unchallenged assumption that somehow converted directly into function. That having a bigger amygdala meant you were better at emotion, which is somewhat paradoxical, given that there was a behavioral theory that men weren't so good at understanding emotion, but they had a bigger amygdala. So yes, I mean, those are the kind of issues where if you have a particular model in mind, you can kind of fit what you find with respect to that. But the other thing about the corpus callosum is that those kind of data have been, or that kind of measures have been taken time and time again. And overall, many reviews of a whole range of studies rather than a collection of single studies have shown that actually there isn't a sex difference in the corpus callosum. But it is still a belief that you can find in sort of secondary sources where people use understanding about the neuroscience of learning or whatever, and refer to women being right hemisphere driven, etc.
Yes, but also the size thing, it won't stand because of the variation. So if scientists, they take like the different people from different population, they may find some brains smaller, some brains bigger, despite of being male or female, right?
Well, that's right. And in fact, what they realized was that the whole issue about a bigger brain, meant you were more intelligent or whatever particular skill you wanted to associate with it. Once they realized, actually, on average, the brains from men, and I use deliberately, are about 8 to 10% bigger than the brains from women. But that's because men are about 8 to 10% bigger. Men are about 8 to 10% bigger than women. So it's a kind of scaling issue. I don't know if any of your listeners are engineers, but if you have a bigger container for the engine, then the engine needs to be reconfigured in a particular way, and the differences that are emerged are just due to the size. And so in fact, then people started saying, well, let's have a look at smaller brains and bigger brains in groups of women, or smaller and bigger brains in groups of men. They found it's actually the size that made the difference, and it was just a scaling issue. So either the particular parts of the brain got bigger, so they were the same distance apart, or the connections between them got longer or stronger because they were connecting structures which were further apart. So once all of those have been corrected for, and there was a paper published earlier this year which looks at 30 years of brain imaging, because once we did have access to intact living human brains, we still continue with the hunt the difference agenda. So somebody's painstakingly been through all of those data and said, great title, dump the dimorphism. There is no evidence that brains from men are different in any meaningful way or consistent way from the brains from women. Bearing in mind that we're still talking about structures, we're talking about MRI or fMRI data. And I think that's something which we should bear in mind, because that's where most of the argument is focused. And where the claim that we can't find sex differences is based, may well be that once we start having a much more subtle look at the brain, looking at brain function, looking at incorporating hormone levels, endocrine activity, gene expression, etc., then we may get a more nuanced view, which may reveal that sex as a factor has a more powerful organizing role in brain differences than we've been able to find so far.
Yeah, I mean, since you already mentioned about the hormones, which is another thing. Even today, it's pressed that the hormonal changes can give those sex differences in the neurology, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the key thing to remember with hormone research is, and I call the 20th century sort of raging hormones century, because that's where, with the continuation of, and quite overtly, women's biology making them vulnerable, less effective, giving them different range of skills, complementary in this case rather than inferior to those of men, but actually not the kind of skills which would make you a great scientist or a leader of the world, etc. So there was a lot of research done on non-human animals, and I stress that deliberately, demonstrating how powerful in non-human animals hormone activity is. And hormone means drive to action, so it was there for a purpose, but it was linked obviously to the reproductive cycle. So it was looking at any activities related directly to reproduction, or perhaps aggression with respect to protection of pups, or staking your territory for the right female, etc. So there was a very powerful belief because you could do lots of experiments. You could manipulate hormone levels in animals before they were born, or you could remove bits of glands from animals and demonstrate how their behavior changed. So very strong argument for the driving role of hormones. And then obviously, we are humans are animals as well, so we have hormones, and they do have an effect that we can demonstrate in human behavior. But the evidence is emerging that it's far less powerful in human society, or the effect of hormones, is not just a sort of biological driver. It interacts powerfully with the social context as well. So, for example, testosterone levels in the fathers of newborn babies are lower if the father is the primary carer than if the father is not the primary carer. So there's a kind of the same event, if you like, but there's a social context with respect to the amount of interaction the new parent has with the new baby. So in the same way that we now understand that the brain is much more powerfully affected by outside events, so are hormones. And so we get into this kind of much more entangled understanding of what's been characterized as nature versus nurture. You know, it's either nature, you are driven by your testosterone to be aggressive or something, or it's nurture where you're only brought up, you know, as a man, you're brought up to be aggressive. What people are saying, no, these two factors, two types of factors are hugely entangled. And we shouldn't actually, if we want to understand the human condition, we shouldn't be trying to separate them.
Yes, I mean, nature nurture is definitely important, and we'll talk more about it. Okay. Before that, there was also something called brain organization theory, where it was proposed that the maleness or femaleness of the brains is fixed during the or in the womb itself.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that earlier because once it was understood that the male fetus was exposed to high levels of testosterone throughout pregnancy, and you know there were obviously clear anatomical differences at birth, and then it was linked to an understanding of the different portfolio of skills and temperaments and patterns of behavior which were true on average of boys and girls. The hormonal factors were used as a description for this brain organization. And of course, you could demonstrate it in non-human animals because you could lower testosterone levels in male fetuses and demonstrate how they behave differently. Or you could almost demonstrate how removing testosterone from a male, or access to testosterone from a male fetus, meant that when it emerged, it behaved like a female during, you know, the reproductive process, etc. So there was an idea that, you know, the hormones not only organized your genitals, as it were, also organized your brain. And it then linked to some research looking at individuals who, for genetic or hormonal deficiency reasons, were exposed to atypical levels of hormones. So girls who were exposed to very high levels of testosterone, for example, in the womb, or males who are exposed to high levels of estrogen in the womb, and looking at those individuals and saying, for example, girls exposed to high levels of testosterone were characterized as being less feminine than girls who hadn't been exposed to those high levels. And at that point, there was measures like the tomboy index. So being less feminine meant if you liked climbing trees or didn't want to get married or weren't interested in getting married, which instantly, of course, reveals how stereotypes actually affect the metrics you're using. You know, the tomboy index, the clue is in the title, if you like. And that continues to be very powerful. And it is a suggestion that if you look at the emergence of and this is probably a term we should discuss at some point, gender differences in behavior in young infants, toy choice, etc., or interest in construction activities. This was suggested to be linked to the exposure to testosterone in the developing brain. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
I mean, because here probably we can connect it with the Simon Baron-Cohen's theory on empathizers and systemizers.
Yeah, yes, that's a good point, and very explicitly linked to testosterone levels. Bearing in mind that Simon Baron-Cohen, to clarify, you're talking about the idea that there are two types of behavior with respect to how you interact with the outside world or how you process information about the outside world. And this is the empathizing, systemizing dimension, where at one level, if you're an empathizer, you're very good at understanding emotion, interpreting emotion, perhaps expressing emotion as well. Whereas if you're a systemizer, and I'm visually using at the other end, although they are not supposed to be either or, you're much more likely to be searching for patterns and rules in the world, to be much more interested in evidence of patterns and rules, perhaps to the extent of collecting such examples of patterns and rules. And Simon Baron-Cohen's theory was really generated with respect to understanding autism, the suggestion that one of the characterizations of autism is, you know, an intense, sometimes pathological interest in rules and cataloguing, or even more extreme sort of very rigid rituals of behavior or self-injury, which was to do with repetitive damage of some kind. He then mapped that on to the idea that autism is a male problem because it was identified as being more common in males and females, something we might come back to. And therefore the logic was that males have the kind of brains which make them systemizers, and an extreme version of those brains will produce behavior which would get them diagnosed as being on the autistic spectrum. And it was linked very specifically to fetal testosterone. And there's a big tranche of research, which this research group in Cambridge has carried out, looking at measures of fetal testosterone in fetuses where, because of the research program, they were able to later identify, subsequently were found to be on the autistic spectrum, or perhaps because they were siblings of individuals on the autistic spectrum, and has linked those findings that there is a powerful correlation alleged, between exposure to high levels of testosterone, fetal testosterone, and subsequent systemizing or even more extreme autism type behavior.
Yeah, and when he applied this to the females?
Well, the idea was, of course, this is where, interestingly, in what you were talking before about the way in which bias can divert or distract particular research aims. It was assumed that autism was a male problem. So in a way, females were less interesting because they didn't then go on to become autistic. Of course, that is not to say that he ignored evidence of females on the autistic spectrum. Although at that point, the focus was very much on the higher end of the spectrum, where you got individuals where you were able to measure behavior or particular skills, but bearing in mind at the other end of the spectrum, you've got, and I use this term carefully, profoundly impaired individuals who never develop language, who are self-injurious, probably will have to be, for their own safety, institutionalized all their lives. Interesting, at that end of the spectrum, the ratio of male to female is more equal. It's at the other end, where it was claimed there were more males. So the focus was, females were measured, but almost as a kind of, just as a control group, they weren't interested at that point. There are more researchers researching, there are more research programs now looking, for example, at brain characterization, because you could say, well, if a female is on the autistic spectrum, does she have a systemizing brain? I think the key issue is we don't really know what a systemizing brain looks like. We know what systemizing behavior looks like, but we haven't been able to say this is the brain of a systemizer.
Yeah, and the systemizer behavior can be there. I mean, there are women scientists, etc. So
yeah, I mean, I think that gets into where you may be heading with respect to the idea that we're now starting to wake up to the fact that there are large numbers of females on the autistic spectrum who just haven't been identified because it was always assumed that it was a male problem. And there are females who will say, you know, I've had mental illness, health problems all my life, and I've been given all sorts of different labels, and, you know, always people saying, well, you behave a bit like you're on the spectrum, but you're female, so you can't be on the spectrum. And it's only, you know, sometimes in their 40s or maybe 50s. I think there was somebody recently in the UK, a sort of high profile television personality, who I think is now 51, who's just been identified as being on the autistic spectrum. So, you know, there is that whole issue about, we're now starting to need to rethink the whole autism theory as well.
Yeah. So in my case, I'm really interested in scientific method, how it works, and of course the importance of it. And once I was reading about all these different sort of biases and how people they address this question, which we will of course talk about, whether this question is relevant question, like on the neurological basis of sex differences, if it's a relevant question or not. But I think the major problem with the evidence was to interpret it, to understand what scientific data shows. I mean, for example, be it the size, the size of the brain, etc., or be it different IQ tests. So the different tests which are being done to show the differences, the different sort of other the other data which is shown from other methods. So, and I think one of the major example is statistics, because it's always difficult to interpret and understand. So I want your comment on it, that how we can really highlight the importance of scientific data and also bust that data which really doesn't make much sense.
Right. Gosh. Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back in a strange kind of way to the discussion about autism, because if you apply a particular filter, if you have a hugely complex data set, brain imaging, for example, especially if you mix it in with behavior as well, you can make hundreds of thousands of comparisons. And you can interrogate it with standard statistics, or we now have much more complicated statistics, and now there are machine learning algorithms. There's yet another layer of complexity. But all of these, the choice of how you analyze your data or how you interpret your data in this area there is strong evidence that it is never biased, because by definition, the scientific method requires you to generate a hypothesis. I believe that male brains are different from female brains. You have an experimental hypothesis, you have a null hypothesis, which there's no difference between male and female brains. You interrogate your data and you come up with some statistically significant differences. And of course, those are the ones you focus on, because those are the ones which, if you like, are supporting the very hypothesis that you've generated. And I'm involved in a project at the moment where if you look at research in this area, and this is not to say that data are in any way fraudulent or deliberately manipulated, it's just saying that there are evidences of papers where 34,000 comparisons can be made of particular pathways in the brain. 74 of them are statistically significant, and we are talking very small differences here, statistical differences. And the use of the term significant is another thing that we should flag up as, for somebody who's not an expert reading the term significant, it probably means something different. So if you focus on those 74, and that's what get reported, and that's the title of your paper, Sex Differences in X, the abstract confirms that these differences were found, maybe references made to fundamental, etc., etc., then that enters the kind of canon of knowledge that people who are not necessarily expert will be drawing on. And, a journalist will want to, be sent a paper to comment on, and will quickly have a look at PubMed or Google Scholar and say, oh, look at the thousands of papers which report differences. And, oh, I'll quickly have a look at a few of them. Oh, yes, look at those differences. Not paying attention to the fact that a much, much greater proportion of comparisons have demonstrated similarity, if you like, rather than difference. So I think it is a major problem in a way with the scientific method, which we're now trying to get away past by, as you and your listeners may know, there's claimed to be a reproducibility crisis in psychology and other sciences, where so-called classic studies on which a whole kind of edifice of interpretation has been founded haven't been able to be replicated. Somebody said, well, that's interesting about, if somebody talks about being old, or you're surrounded by pictures of old people, you tend to walk slightly slower, except, kind of social psychology type belief. Nobody's been able to reproduce that, but it's quite a popular theory, and talking about priming and what you're exposed to makes you behave in a different way. So now people are saying, well, the trouble is that if you establish a hypothesis and you don't find difference, you might not even publish it, or you might submit it for publication and the reviewers will say there must be something wrong because you haven't found this difference. But if you now say, well, I'm going to pre-register what I intend to do and the questions I intend to ask and the statistics I intend to use, you can get that accepted for publication. And then you do your study and you do the analysis that you said you were going to do, and you report all of the findings, even if they're all negative in terms of your hypothesis. So at last, the research canon, the body of research evidence is starting to show a different picture, to show a picture not that there are thousands of papers reporting significant differences in male-female brains, say, but there are even more thousands of papers which haven't been able to find any differences, which will, of course, give a different impression.
Yes. So again, this gives me a hint of this biases, which definitely we need to talk about. But before that, let's enter into your work, which is on brain imaging. And let's give a brief introduction of what is brain imaging and fMRI, the methods that you've been using.
Okay, well, I mean, you can characterize every decade, perhaps, or even more quickly, there are slightly more different ways of imaging brains emerging, which is really exciting. Brain imaging itself was really only established in the 1990s with MRI, where you could get detailed structural images of the brain and structures within the brain, which were generated by looking at blood flow in the brain. So you actually weren't looking at brain function directly. You were able to track, sorry, I need to take a step back. So the structural MRI allowed you to look at the images. When you then started talking about functional MRI, you could track blood flow, and you could therefore get an idea of which parts of the brain were more or less, which is probably important, which is very often not paid any attention to, active, if you were giving somebody a language task or a memory task, or getting them to listen to music, etc. So we started to get very good pictures of where things were happening in the brain, down to millisecond and millimeter resolution. So very good pictures, very seductive as well, because when they were all they are effectively is looking at blood flow, and you get numbers, and then people are saying, well, tracking these numbers is not going to be terribly interesting. Let's find a way of turning them into images, and then saying, well, how are we going to characterize changes in blood flow away from one area towards another? Let's color code them. So you immediately got these amazingly compelling images of very detailed side images of the brain with red and blue blobs on them, showing with this bit got more active, this bit less active. So immediately there was this impression that we had a direct window into real-time activity in the brain, which definitely isn't the case. Maybe getting a bit closer to it, but at that point, and that's really where brain imaging took off. And it then, and this was amazing because we could look at, as I said, intact living human brains and intact living humans. But the focus was still on the structures, and blood flow itself is actually very slow. So oddly, the kind of behaviors that we are interested in, like language or memory or speaking or whatever, all takes place on a millisecond time window. Before MRI, all we really had for understanding what was happening in the brain was EEG or electroencephalography, which was literally putting electrodes on the surface of the skull, picking up the electrical signals from the surface of the brain, which were passing through meninges and skin and hair and bone, etc., to these little electrodes, and tracking this electrical activity that was taking place over the surface of the brain. You couldn't go very deep early on, and seeing if we could relate it to behavior in a particular way. At the extreme, it was very good, for example, of identifying where the locus of epileptic seizures. So again, where something was happening, and you could see if there was suddenly a huge explosion of activity from a particular part of the brain. If you were stimulating a seizure in some way, then you could say, well, that's where the problem is. But the trouble with EEG was that it couldn't, because it was being distorted by going through skull, meninges, etc. you had to build in a kind of correction for what you were picking up with the electrode. And you're bearing in mind the size of the brain and 86 billion nerve cells that make up the brain. An electrode stuck there and another one stuck there was, not going to give you a very detailed picture. So then magnetoencephalography emerged, and that's the technique I've almost exclusively used since I went to Aston in 2000, because Aston was the first lab in the UK which had a whole head MEG. And that is because the electrical signals which are associated with brain cell activity, as the physicists or even the non-physicists among you will know, wherever there's electrical activity, there's a magnetic field associated with it. The advantage of measuring the magnetic field is that is not distorted by passing through bone and skin, etc. So you get a much better idea of what activity there is. The disadvantage is these magnetic fields are tiny, absolutely vanishingly small. So you needed a system which would actually allow you to look at those tiny fields and pick them out from the noise which was associated with being in the world, which is there's lots of magnetic fields, and the activity of the brain itself. So we then had a very weird system, which was a bit like a hairdryer, which was full of helium, where you could have sensors which could pick up these tiny magnetic fields, and you could then produce the images much the same as fMRI, which showed you where the activity was occurring, but also allowed you to characterize it in terms of different frequencies, which is where the original EEG had been interesting, because you could look at alpha activity, which is associated with the brain being less active. You could look at gamma, which could be to do with the brain putting information together, a whole range of activity. So we have very good ways of knowing where things are happening, and that's where fMRI and MRI are very good. When things are happening, which is where EEG is good, because you get the classic waveforms in milliseconds, which you could originally came out on moving bits of paper, but we can now turn into images in the same way the fMRI can. And we've got MEG, which allows you to characterize when and where and what is happening. Trouble with MEG, it was a bit difficult because this huge hairdryer, you had to be in a magnetically shielded room in this dewar, as it's called, which was full of helium with these superconducting interference devices or squids. But now, just in the last 5 years, they're starting to develop magnetometers, as they're called, which can be embedded in helmets, which participants can wear in real time, moving around in the world. They don't have to be in a magnetically shielded room. So that's a very, very long answer by saying we have amazingly detailed techniques of looking at structures in the brain. We're starting to understand the time scale. It's almost like moving from a camera, if you like, to a video, so we can start to characterize what the brain is doing. But we still have to correlate it with behavior. We're still not at the stage where we can watch how somebody's behaving and saying this is what their brain will look like. In the same way, in fact, a male or a female comes into my lab, I can't say this is what their brain should look like, even if it doesn't, because we don't have that kind of template, which is where we're trying to get away from just dividing brains into either male or female and losing all sorts of interesting variation. Is that enough about brain imaging?
Yeah, this is perfect. I think now if people will see those beautiful images of brain with different parts colored, they will at least understand how these images they come into existence.
Yes, yeah, I mean, and they are. And the other thing to remember, actually, particularly with MRI, is that these images are not real-time images. They are images which are generated as an end product of a really, really complex chain of statistical manipulation, not fraudulent, but also, you have to convert the blood flow data signals that you're getting into the imaging program so you can generate the images. And then you're going to produce an image which is probably an average over everybody. So if you're interested in memory, you might get the person just to sit in the scanner and read a list of words. And then you say to them, and that forms the baseline. And then you say, I'd like you to read this list of words and learn them in order, because I'm going to give you a test later. And then you get the two patterns of activity with the baseline and the memorizing, and you take one from the other. So what you're actually looking at is a, in itself, image of a difference, which, bearing in mind, you know, the campaign we're on with respect to hunt the difference, again, makes you think, if you're starting off with an idea that there's a difference, and in order to prove that difference, you're taking one group from another, you are slightly biasing what you're finding. So when you see these images, this is not, you know, this is your BBC radio presenter, which is the kind of thing they love to do, looking at, you know, whatever the particular area of interest they have. It's actually the end product of something really much more complicated. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah. So no, here the interesting thing was that so the understanding that came from these methods, that so are there specific areas for certain skills or certain activities in the brain?
That is a great question. And in a way, it goes right back to the kind of phrenology when we were feeling bumps on the head and saying, well, that, you know, if you've got a bigger bump there, you're better at maths. And if you're, you know, got a bigger bump there, you'll make a better mother, kind of thing. Yeah, that is almost this kind of mapping, and it is referred to as human brain mapping. You know, there is an organization of human brain mapping. We should be able to find out where in the brain things are done. And we did used to have these wonderful diagrams, which got more sophisticated. You know, this is where language was done, or it became sophisticated networks. So, but you know, these wonderful language, you know, this is where a noun is processed, this is where a verb is processed. And we now know the brain doesn't really work that way. We have, now we can track activity. We can track activity in real time. You can see that there are networks constantly being formed and dissolved over millisecond time windows. So, you know, the brain solves problems in a hugely dynamic fashion, not with respect to this is the bit that does language. Having said that, if you do look at the networks, it's clear that there are some parts of the brain which are more consistently involved in certain types of processing. And there are some parts of the brain which are involved in almost all types of processing. If you've got part of the brain which is something to do, if you like, with monitoring mistakes, you know, whatever you're doing, there should be something in the brain which is monitoring your mistakes. And that can be everything from, you know, visual illusions or memory tasks to social behavior as well. So, you know, there is parts of the brain which are involved all the time, and there are other parts of the brain which are involved differently. The sensory areas are much more specialized. So there are parts of the brain which only do vision and parts of the brain which only do audition. But when you get away from really basic processing like that, the whole of the brain is involved all the time. So you can't pin down any part of the brain and say, right, that's language.
Exactly. So this basically shows that neuroplasticity, which happens during the brain, right, or in the brain.
Yes, that's right. I mean, and the whole concept of neuroplasticity, in a way, should revolutionize our thinking about the brain. In particular, it should change our mind about these kind of male-female brain differences, because the original theory about what the essentialism biology is destiny theory was based on the idea, and the brain organization theory as well, that there was the kind of developmental endpoint. You know, once the brain started growing, that was it. It was fixed. It didn't change in any way. And whatever way in which it processed information, that's what carried you through the rest of your life until the kind of cognitive cliff that unfortunately we fall off when we get older. Although that in itself we can rethink, thankfully. And I think the plasticity idea was that people started to realize that once we acquired skills or were exposed to different experiences, the brain still changed. You could still see changes in structures which increased in size, changes in patterns of activation which got greater or interestingly smaller. You know, as you became more expert, sometimes the patterns of activation got more focused. And so we could see that the brain could change throughout our lives, and that anything we did, from learning to drive a black cab in London, or a musical instrument, or learning to juggle, or playing video games. Children love it when I go and give talks in schools and say how important video games are. Their teachers are less enthralled. But it demonstrates that there isn't an end product. And if a brain of whatever kind is or isn't exposed to different experiences, perhaps because of the sex of its owner, then that brain would change because of those experiences, not directly because of the sex of its owner. So the idea that what's going on outside the brain will affect the brain as much as some kind of unfolding, predetermined biological script within the brain is really important.
Exactly. So how would you sum it up for nature-nurture correlation with the neuroplasticity?
Well, I think the neuroplasticity, in a way, should take us away from the idea of nature versus nurture, which is a term which is still used, and it's used in defense of all sorts of things, because people like me who are interested in challenging some of the orthodoxies, if you like, will be, characterized as sex difference deniers. And what you're saying is what we're not denying, that there are sex differences, although you can come back if you're just focusing on fMRI tap data, we haven't been able to find any. What we want, what we're saying is that differences can emerge for other reasons. Somebody might be better at spatial cognition, not because they're a male, but because from age 2, they've been given construction toys to play with. They've been encouraged, in mathematical thinking. They have, sports which are spatially determined. They have occupations which require them to think spatially. And so those are the factors we don't dismiss male, female, but we say there are other factors which we need to understand if this is a difference which we think is important to unpick, which with respect to spatial cognition, it very much is, because it's very much related to being able to do science, for example.
Exactly. Let's highlight here the those neuroplastic differences during the development. I mean, so of course, all of us, we start with babies with a single cell embryo, and
Yep.
then of course after the birth we also experience certain environments. So how these experience changes the brain behavior?
At this point, we can really only theorize, because effectively what you really want is some wonderful longitudinal study where somehow you discover, how the brain changes, if you like, from the moment of conception, if you're going to really complicate it, or perhaps from the moment of birth and track somebody over throughout their lives, if you want. Obviously, you're not going to be able to do that. But it's certainly the case that people are very interested in whether or not we can demonstrate sex differences in the brain prenatally, because they say, well, that demonstrates that there is some kind of biological imperative, which there probably is, and why wouldn't there be? Because these brains haven't been exposed to, the cultural bombardment, gender bombardment, if that's the difference you're interested in, that is true of, the human world in the 21st century. So I think in terms of understanding how the brain changes, we've always known that brain development in babies is a time of huge change. I mean, the statistics associated with the number of cells being produced by the minute within the prenatal infant and then once the baby starts growing. So tracking that in itself would be a huge issue. So we know the brain's changing all the time. People are very interested, is it changing differently in boys and girls? And nobody's been able to pin that down. But of course, they then start saying, well, they're behaving differently, so their brains must be different. Because at that point, there wasn't an understanding of how social, for example, very newborn babies are. So they are constantly monitoring cues in the outside world, which effectively allow them to survive, because you need to know who's your in-group, who's going to be your carer, because human babies are terribly dependent for a lot longer period of lives than almost any other non-human animal species. So we are aware of how much the baby's brain is changing all the time. We used to think that the frontal lobes, which were supposedly the area where the high-level cognition was processed, because babies didn't demonstrate any high-level cognition, they assumed that the frontal lobes were silent and babies were referred to as subcortical. We now know through other techniques, which I didn't mention in my brain imaging, like infrared technology, where you can actually look at brain activity because the skulls of babies are much closer to their brains, if you like, and much more transparent. And you can actually see how areas of activity change with respect to when babies are exposed to environmental sounds or significant other sounds, or sounds of their mother, sight of their mother, etc. So you can see all these changes occurring all the time. But you can also see how much they are affected by what's going on in the outside world. So pretty soon they will respond more positively to the sound of their mother's voice than to other environmental sounds. So clearly there's already some kind of differentiating going on. And then when they get to the age of language emerges, they can interact with people, they can choose toys, or they're given toys and they can play with one sort of toy more than the other. Then there's a whole kind of behavioral measuring, which people then say, well, this is because their brain has reached this type of development. But other people could say, well, that's because this particular brain has been exposed to different experiences from that particular brain. So that's another whole area, looking at the effect of gender stereotypes, toy choice, way in which you voice, the belief that little boys are more robust and mobile than little girls, all of that will affect the brain.
Yeah, I think the here fraternal identical twins can really shed the light, where if two siblings, if they are of opposite sex, and while growing up, how they choose something or do certain things, which can really highlight the importance of the environment in general, right?
Yeah,
the sex
I mean, that's right. I mean, in a way, sometimes I say to people say to me, so you think men's brains are the same as women's brains? And I say, no, I think every brain is different from every other brain. And I said, my brain will be different from the person sitting next to me or the person sitting next to you, even if they're your identical twin. So because there's a huge amount of genetically determined variation in everybody. And that's one of the weird things that brain images or neuroscientists have been trying to find, the common factors, what makes all men like this or all women like that, bearing in mind that even the most dyed-in-the-wool biological determinists would acknowledge that there's a huge amount of variability within the two populations, and the two sets of data overlap hugely. So calling something a difference when there is a huge amount of overlap between the data from the two groups with a tiny little average difference is something we should probably query at some point. Yeah, so the idea of identical twins, but again, you could say, well, generally speaking, they're exposed to identical environments, so maybe their brains would be more similar than the brains of non-identical twins, for example. But then people will produce the sort of anecdotes of identical twins who were separated at birth and reared separately, and then when they got together, they looked very similar, but also had quite similar experiences in life. But of course, identical twins will be physically identical. Their bodies will be very similar. And we have to bear in mind that our brains don't float around. They are carried around in a body. And if that body is the same as another body or is different from another body, the world will interact with it differently. So these reared apart stories don't bear in mind the fact that and talk about amazing coincidences. Say, they married somebody with the same name or something, or got married on the same day. There are other factors which could determine that similarity as much as the genetic factors.
Well said. And I think it also brings us to the key point, whether the question of sex differences is relevant to the understanding of cognition and science in general of the brain is or not.
I think, I mean, I wouldn't say or not, because then that gets into this kind of driving people into their defensive silos. It's either male and female are different, or, it's not. I think it should be much more irrelevant than it is. I mean, people talk about a gender neutral future. And I think a great future would be a gender irrelevant future, where being male or female is way down the list of any kind of characteristic that people would bear in mind in understanding who you are and what you can do, or what you might be able to do, or how you might respond. So I think I think that's a key issue. I wouldn't say no, pay no attention to male or female, because anyway, by the time you're asking that question, perhaps of the 6-year-olds in your classroom or your new intake of undergraduate students, they have been exposed to a very gendered world for 2-year-olds, for example, proportionally all of their lives. So the fact that they choose different toys, or boys start to reject things that are pink, and girls like dressing up as princesses, is not irrelevant if you want to understand it, but it doesn't mean that we can ignore everything else. I mean, I think what I'm saying is that we should, what sex is this person should not be the only question that is asked, because it's not going to give you the right answer.
Yes, and even if we are looking for certain solutions, we'll have to overcome those biases. Here, I think the one important work which comes from Lisa Feldman Barrett and Julie Wormwood, and they talk about affective realism, that your feelings and expectation can affect what you're looking for.
Yeah. I mean, I think that Lisa Feldman Barrett's work is great, because in a way, focusing on emotion and how we used to think about emotion, and we'd look, for the anger center in the brain and the happiness center in the brain, etc. That whole story, and her revelation is that in a way there are no different emotions. What we do, we experience some physical changes, and we interpret them in terms of what we expect, what we see in the world around us, etc. But I think with respect to the work that she did, I mean, some of the work really quite worrying in terms of, I think it was in the US, the number of people who'd been shot by the police because the police believed they were carrying a gun. And in fact, they weren't. It was a mobile phone or a wallet or something. But the person was convinced that this person had it, because the context and their system of beliefs, we have to bear in mind, led them to believe and see that, that there was a gun, and they shot the person. And you can, with far less political implications, you can manipulate that kind of thing in the lab, and people will see things and report that they saw things which absolutely weren't there, but because they had a particular filter or expectation, if you like. It almost as though it tricked the brain. So the brain says, yeah, that must, because the brain is a prediction machine. The brain is not just a passive recipient of information. The brain is generating predictions all the time, saying, if you see this sight, that's what it means. If you hear this sound, or even, social behavior, if somebody comes towards you with their hand outstretched, this is what you should expect at the end of it, or how you should behave. So we're being driven around by a prediction machine, which fortunately for the human race, most of the time gets it completely right. But because it's working on a kind of general algorithm, and it's a self-organizing system which hasn't as yet met something which meant, I need to rethink that prediction. It can make mistakes. And that's exactly what Lisa Feldman Barrett is demonstrating. And I feel really angry, or I feel really happy, or really sad. And then you can say, well, you feel like that because we manipulated this context. And because our feelings about our consciousness are so profound, it's quite difficult to tell somebody, actually, you've been tricked, or your brain has tricked you, which gets you into all other arguments about dualism and mind-brain splits, etc., which perhaps we won't talk about today.
Yeah, but before that, I think that people need to understand, and this new view of brain, as you rightly mentioned, that it's more neuroplastic, it can change, and it is a prediction machine.
Yes, and the fact that it doesn't have to be actual events which change how the brain processes information. It can be expectations or attitudes. So that if you are told that people like you aren't very good at a task like this, surprise, surprise, your brain will process that task differently. You will make more mistakes. So we get locked into this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that's almost more important, because it demonstrates that this is not just talking about how the fact that children's clothes, for example, or coming up to Christmas, terribly gendered, girls have got pink and unicorns and boys have got dark green and dinosaurs and stuff like that. All of these things, it's not just it's just a bit of fun. It actually really indicates how powerfully our society in the 21st century codes these differences. So a kind of small child exposed to this world thinks these must be really important because they even dress people differently. It gives them different toys to play with. So these differences are really important. And unpacking that, I think that's really important in terms of people achieving their potential, and also looking at mental health statistics and suicide rates in young men and eating disorders in young women. Whatever it is that is driving particular people is not serving all of them well.
Yeah, time to time I really like to find some these visual illusions, which basically reminds myself that, okay, I mean, I have a brain, but it can change, and how it can trick us. Yeah,
that's right. You really do see a triangle in the Knitzer triangle.
Exactly.
And even if you actually know that there isn't a triangle there, you experience a triangle.
Yeah, or this the rotating head of Einstein, this sort of illusion. Yeah,
answer who rotates one way and then suddenly starts rotating another way. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, and I got the similar reference from your book as well, which was the bias in artificial intelligence. It's very interesting that so of course we build something and then we call it intelligence, but then still once those biases pop up, I mean
who puts the
amazing.
data in, bias out. I mean, I think that's a nice example and something which is why I think it's important that we pay attention to misunderstanding or misrepresentation of whatever sex differences there are, because there's some really nice work published this year looking at emerging science, the future of science, how our future is going to be shaped by these emerging sciences, which is things like robotics and artificial intelligence. And then you look at the proportion of women in those areas, and they're vanishingly small. And I use the term vanishingly because in some cases the numbers are going backwards. And you think the world is building its future on the basis of input from only 50% of its population. And, let alone that there's male, females, you've also got people with ethnic minorities, disabilities, neurodiverse individuals, etc., different sexual orientation, every one of whom experiences the world differently and who really needs to be inputting into these, these future developments. So that's in a way why it's more important. It's not just a, public science argument or an anatomy argument. It's actually our future, which we need to be aware of how we're biasing, how our future is going to be determined by shutting out a large proportion of the people whose data need to be input into this future.
Exactly. I think here, what I really wanted to ask you or know if there is any evidence regarding this tribal instinct or these certain kind of biases that they light up when the people are in the scanners.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you mean by tribal instinct. I think it's characterizing it more as in-group and out-group.
Yeah.
Which is very much we can demonstrate that people will process information differently, faces lists of adjectives about individuals, if they're led to believe that this individual is part of their group or is part of a group that they'd like to belong to, etc., as opposed to outgroups where people look differently, behave differently, speak differently, and going back to the comment I made earlier about babies being junior gender detectives or junior difference detectives from a very early age, in terms of survival, we do need to notice differences. So, we are born as difference notices, if that's a word. Then society may well lead us to attach different values to those differences. So, if you belong to groups of people who look like this, then you should respond positively if you're seeking somebody who's going to support you, as opposed to somebody who looks like that, who is not generally part of your in-group. So I think if that's what you mean by the kind of tribalism, where the same people stick together and respond rather negatively to people who are different, that is an inbuilt characteristic. It's a survival mechanism, if you like. And it's something that people who run, for example, diversity or generate diversity and inclusion initiatives which is great because people are looking at gender gaps in the world and thinking, these people, who seem not to appear on our statistics are equally competent, possibly more competent. We need more people like that. How do we get them to want to join this organization or be part of this research culture or whatever? So that's a difficulty which we have to confront. It's human nature for us to want to be in tribes. What we need to do is to break down what constitutes your tribe. So your tribe doesn't have to be all white male scientists, for example. Your tribe should also include other genders, people from different ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, whatever. So I think that's really quite hard because there is a kind of basic, oh, that person is different, which very often is unconscious and sometimes is quite conscious.
I think it'll be really interesting to see how or what future science brings in this aspect, because no matter what topic we choose today in the social setup, be it women rights or diversity in science or diversity in the society, different sexuality, etc. All of this, I think they go back to, or they highlight this point about being tribal in general.
Yeah, and I think also it's in terms of literally upsetting the status quo or challenging orthodoxies, because people would say, for example, in science, science, isn't it amazing what science has done? Who has done it? Oh, it happens to be white males. So, why do we want any more than white males in science? So people demonstrating, and in business and, the bottom line in finance, etc., demonstrating that diversity is a positive thing is the first thing we have to do, because otherwise people would say, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But there is another kind of political issue as well, which is a great phrase, which I must find out who said, is if you've lived a life of privilege, then equality can feel like oppression. So you've actually got to say to the tribe who's run the world so far, it's not just up to you anymore. You've got to allow other people into your tribe and make it our tribe, if you like.
Exactly. Yeah. When we are talking about this topic, we can also talk about another thing which generally nowadays it's like a lot of people are opening about their sexuality. And so apart from sex differences in men and women, there is also transgender brains, right? So what's the science about that?
I must switch slightly when you said transgender brains, because I think we need to be careful about using terms like that. Yeah. I mean, I think, people say to me, will the transgender brain be different from a cisgender brain? I say, yeah, absolutely, of course it will, because the transgender person has had a completely different experience or set of experiences in their lives. So there will be differences, particularly with respect to how they process relevant information that's relevant to them. I mean, I think it goes back to the idea that we haven't really touched on, that the difference between sex and gender. And when we talk about sex differences in the brain, used to be, when this 18th, 19th century, it was assumed that the biology, of course, is destiny. So we only needed the term sex. So we had sex differences in the brain, sex differences in behavior, sex roles. There is still a journal called Sex Roles, etc. So you didn't need, and if you like, the clue was in the name. And then in the 1980s, with respect to the second wave of feminism, which comes back to the question you might ask right at the beginning, there was a kind of pushback against the biological vulnerability, biology is destiny type argument, and saying you are preventing large numbers of people from doing things or assuming they can't based on their biology. And all of these differences actually arise from societal pressures. So they talked about gender in that way, and saying that biology is irrelevant and it's what society expects which determines what you can do and what you think about yourself. So that was the other extreme, if you like. And I think what I've been trying to do is to merge these two and say biology is not irrelevant. You know, as a lifelong neuroscientist, I would hope I wouldn't think that. But what we do need to understand is that sex is entangled with gender. And in fact, I now use the term sex stroke gender because I don't like to think, unless we're actually talking about chromosomes or gametes, etc. I think the two are so entangled that you probably should get away from using either one or the other unless you're very clear about what you're doing. But the issue with gender identity and people with different sexualities, in a way, I think we need to get away from the biology's destiny and sever this theory that there is, or expectation that there's an inevitable and invariant connection between your biological sex and whatever you want to call your place in society, your gendered role, your gendered expectation, you know, the appearance you like to have, etc. So it used to be thought gender was binary because sex was binary. And now you can say, well, actually, it doesn't have to be binary if you accept this severance between biology and gender. You know, there could be as many genders in the world as there are people. And maybe, you know, when I talk about gender irrelevance, maybe we should get away from that particular term, if you like, because it's not value free, as we know. So I think it's offering to people the idea that gender isn't something that's inevitably biologically determined, and your identity and your sexuality and your ambitions in life or whatever, or who you want to spend your time with, it is not determined by the sex you were assigned at birth, and you could be anything you like. And as we know, that argument is not supported within the transgender community itself, for who do believe in the power of biology to the extent that they're saying, you know, the classic, and I don't like to trivialize or mischaracterize this, but people saying I've got a female brain in a male body and wishing to change their body to match the brain. For me, I think that's it's unnecessary. I mean, it's hugely draconian, but you can understand where they're coming from when there is such this big emphasis on, you know, that you look like a female or you look like a male, and so that becomes embedded as really important in your aims for yourself.
Exactly. I generally like to look at it from the evolutionary point of view, because once you start going beyond human species, you look at other cousins, you know, apes, bonobos, for example. I really like bonobos, where you see matriarch societies, and they are really friendly in that sense. It completely changes your perception about sex, gender, and in general, the way we look at individuals in the society.
Yeah, I mean, evolution can be used, it's a double-edged sword, particularly in this area, because evolutionary psychologists, perhaps less than biologists, will dismiss the idea that there aren't male or female brains or male or female ways of doing things, because that's another whole area. We've gone back and looked at all of these, the go-to list of males are better at science and women are better at emotion and language, and demonstrated in the same way as brains that actually that's not true if you look at the data properly. But evolutionary psychologists would say, you know, you're denying evolution, because the reason the human race has survived is because one group of people who were the taller, stronger, bigger people did the hunting, and the other group of people did the gathering and the nurturing, etc. And so, you know, you can't overturn evolution. So at one level, they're saying this argument, you know, it's like a straw man almost. You know, this argument doesn't hold true unless you're going to deny biology, deny evolution, which I find really annoying, actually, because I think evolution is all about progress, and what we're talking about, humans, society being different from non-human society, is evolution in its sense, in itself. And we also need to realize that because human society has generated a very constraining culture, if you think about gender, for example, then actually what we're looking at is the effect of evolution, the effect of a culture which doesn't allow our hugely wonderfully flexible brains to actually develop their full potential and can actually come up with harmful outcomes, which evolutionarily speaking is not generally what we're aiming for. So I think evolution, yeah, it's a tricky one, but and very often the camps, you know, it's the evolutionary psychologists and biologists less so, versus the feminist the feminist sex difference deniers, which is a shame, because I think there's actually more common belief than is characterized, but everybody likes a fight, so they like to see, you know, the latest feminist science trashed by the evolutionary camp, or the other way around.
Exactly. I think, I mean, of course, at the end, we can say that nature and nurture, they are together, like, or it's, again, as you mentioned, that it's about.
Well, you kind of think that's what my belief, my understanding is that's what evolution is about. But anyway, yeah, okay.
Yeah. But I think it's just the you know, that how fast things can change. I mean, of course, one way we can look at our tribal instincts, but on the other hand, we can also look at the way we have certain treaties during the war, right? That the
Right.
So it's both ways that we have these things.
Yeah, I think the trouble is with tribal instinct is sometimes they're used as an absolutist, you know, can't change because you know, you're going to undermine evolution. I mean, Darwin himself, you know, was worried about, you know, suggesting that women should be educated would undermine the progress of evolution. So that, you know, there is a history with respect to challenging evolution if you're perceived to be challenging. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah. Okay, so here let's take the last question, which should be so once you started, there was a certain status of the society in the society, and also in STEM, in the science. And now what is the status of women and in general the diversity in science?
Gosh, how long have you got? I mean, it's interesting in terms of women in science, because the reason you're probably asking this question, because as you know, I'm a great campaigner to overcome the underrepresentation of women in science. You know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, the future of human civilization it could well be determined by a hugely unbalanced population. So it needs addressing. But there's something called the gender equality paradox emerging, which suggests that it used to be the case that women didn't do science. I mean, actually, if you go far enough back in history, women did do science, and there was a lot of women who were astronomy, botany, etc. There's a big history of very effective, Ada Lovelace obviously is an example, women in science, but they were women who tended to have the money and the support of whoever, or were independent, who pursued very interesting, very detailed lines of science. But then science professionalized itself and started becoming science as a profession. And so there were people who were scientists, and there were organizations, institutions, which were for scientists, and they excluded women deliberately. So women were kind of written out of science for a very long time. And then there was a suggestion that actually that was a good thing, because women didn't have the necessary skills to be scientists. And we get back to this kind of spatial thinking and the idea that there was some kind of cognitive inferiority. And now it's quite clear that once women have access to education, etc., there is no issue of cognitive differences between the groups, and may well be within the groups. But there's a new argument emerging where people are looking at gender gaps in the world, which are determined by huge numbers of measures, access to education, health outcomes, financial independence, political representation, etc. So the World Economic Forum produces a global gender gap index every year, 156 plus countries, and looks at gender gaps in each of these areas, and looks at those countries with the smallest gender gaps. Nobody's reached gender equality at all, but countries like Iceland and Scandinavia have the smallest gender gaps in terms of numbers. And we must bear this in mind if you take a metric such as how many MPs are there, etc. And they generate an overall metric which says, Iceland is almost always at the top with respect to the smallest gender gap. And then they started interrogating these countries with respect to representation of women in science, and saying that the countries with the smallest gender gaps, proportionally and paradoxically, allegedly, have the greatest underrepresentation of women in science. So in countries which in theory are offering women full opportunities with respect to the choice they're making with their careers, access to education, higher education, etc., women are choosing not to do science. And so there's a new kind of essentialist argument emerging, saying that very often people choose to do science in less developed countries, male or female, because that those careers have the highest salaries. So there's some kind of economic driver, which irrespective of what you want to do, you do science because you're going to get more money. But if you're in a country where that's less of a driver, and that in itself could possibly be an item of discussion, you follow your heart, I think is what they do talk about efficacy and joy. And also the fact that women tend to be better at reading, which is another area we might think about what they're saying about science. So women go off and do humanities and more literary or literate type subjects and not science. And this is due to endogenous factors. So we're coming back to the idea that, okay, let's get away from competence. Let's have a look at preference, temperament, nurturing, etc. And that's what's continuing to drive women away from science. But the argument is that they've leveled the playing field and women are not doing science. My argument is if you really look at science, there is no evidence at all that it's a level playing field for women. And luckily, science itself is starting to wake up for that and looking at how do we reward people? Is there any evidence of gender bias? How do we encourage people to progress? How do we support their progression in terms of work-life balance? Who's the primary author in the papers that we count, who gets the biggest grants, etc. So all of that. And they're starting to realize that science is not a level playing field. So until they've solved those problems, you can't really explain why women have much lower status. As we're starting to address the initial pipeline problem, more girls are choosing to do science, but not actually, if you look at physics and computer science, not equal numbers. And maybe you're not necessarily talking about equal numbers, but there is a surprising imbalance there. But they disappear as you go up the hierarchy in science, that maybe there's equality of undergraduates, less in postgraduates, even less in PhD, postdocs, early career researchers. And then as you go up to career professors, etc., the numbers, tell the story. So, I mean, that's a very long answer to your question about the status of women in science. I think women still have second-class status in STEM, and that's why they're choosing not to do science, because your brain is driving you towards your tribe, to the idea that you need to belong. So if you look at this tribe and you think, I think they call it male, pale, and stale, don't they? You think, that doesn't look like me. And if I look at who wins the prizes in these areas, they're all male. Who gets these big grants, and what's the picture of somebody? So it's great when a female wins the Nobel Prize and everybody's, of course, it's tiny little numbers, but we've got to start somewhere.
Exactly. I mean, last year there were Nobel Prizes for women. This year, no.
None. Yeah.
So
yeah.
I was talking to another scientist, and she said the same thing, that if this we can't overcome, because it also depends in the bigger committees, right? As you already mentioned, in the grant committees, in the prize committees, how many women are there?
Indeed.
And this is where
you can't just make women do the heavy lifting. If you want more representation, it's all down to you. It's down to the men as well, which comes to this idea about if you've lived a life of privilege, which, if you like, male scientists have, then they've got to step up to the mark, and they've got to want there to be greater diversity in their communities. It doesn't necessarily have to be more women. It could be more disabled people with different sexualities, or more neurodiverse. But you can't. I mean, and this comes back, personally. If you're the only woman in a department, you suddenly find yourself on all of the appointments boards because somebody said, "Oh, we have a woman on the appointment board," and and then all of your career gets diverted into away from what is likely to give you success, etc. So you need to to get the men on board as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So what do you think? What is the solution of it? Like, should we? I mean, of course, we can talk more about it. We should discuss more about it. But at the end, what do you think? How at the higher level? I mean, do we need to start at the higher level or at the lower level? Or
well, I mean, all the way through. I mean, coming back to the early years, you know, the fact that girls choose not to do science is actually an outcome of the kind of gendered impression of who does science that they've received, you know, from the age of 6. Age of 6, girls are saying maths is the boy thing, so I won't do maths when I grow up, kind of thing. And you know, and they believe that, you know, that it's but they have a kind of naive logic, you know, where, you know, all the scientists I see are men, so only men can be scientists, kind of thing. And that's quite difficult to overcome if it's well embedded in your sense of who you are and what you can do. So I think we need to start early. I think we need to start at the top, certainly, because that's where the decisions are made. That's where you know, the prize committees and who devises progression pathways, etc. And also with the money. I mean, in the UK, it was really interesting. The Athena Swan programme evolved to deal with the underrepresentation of women in science, and got to universities and saying all the science departments could really be having a look at evidence of gender imbalance and what they're going to do about it effectively. You know, is there something within your curriculum, your staff profile, what you teach, how you teach it, which might address this imbalance? And you know, you were awarded a bronze award if you were paying attention, and a silver award if you were doing something about it, and a gold award if you were succeeding in doing something about it. And it got to the point where if you didn't have a silver award, you couldn't apply for Medical Research Council grants. So money came into it, and instantly the Athena Swan became something which every university was paying attention to. And you know, men were volunteering to be on the Athena Swan committees within universities, etc. So you know, whatever it takes, but it will be money, I'm sure, but it will also be people, big strong evidence that more diverse groups are more successful. So you know, that's another way of pushing people, or just people who have a sense of social justice, or who realize, you know, when they go into schools or they talk to their young female career researchers who then disappear, what a waste of talent this attitude is.
Exactly. I mean, as you also mentioned in your book, it's more like whack-a-mole kind of thing, that we need to hit on those points to overcome these kind of biases in the society.
Indeed. And I mean, interestingly, I was talking about whack-a-mole next week to a group of philosophers, etc. Why is it so hard? Because, you know, at one level, obviously, this is an interest and a passion of mine. And I find it very difficult that people really dig their heels in. They really want to believe that males and females are different. Let boys be boys, kind of thing. And, you know, they understand. There was just an MP last week saying that there's a television program called Doctor Who, very popular sort of science fiction story. And the last Doctor Who was female. So this MP was saying, you know, boys haven't got role models anymore. The only role models they have are these criminals or something. So there is a kind of irrational, I think, pushback saying, you know, this is an orthodoxy that you mustn't challenge. And I find that and they will hang on to, you know, there's just one piece of evidence that somebody's got to come up with, and there's a kind of gotcha mentality, which you say there's no sex differences in the brain. Have you seen this paper in Journal of Neuroscience? And you say, hey, I don't say there are no sex differences in the brain. And yes, I'm sure it's a very good paper, but you know, if you look at all of the papers overall, do they all tell the same story? But there is this continuous pushback because people, it's a real orthodoxy, and it makes people feel uncomfortable because effectively you're saying your tribes shouldn't be your tribes anymore. We should all be one tribe as opposed to two different tribes, because you can be safe in your tribe and do what your tribe's always done, ignoring that other tribe and making sure that they don't in any way come onto your territory, etc. Invade your territory, I think is the word I mean, yes.
Yeah, so with that, I should thank you. Thank you for accepting the invitation to come here to speak. This was a great discussion, and thank you for doing all the different works. I mean, for the
Well,
neuroscience, for the science, and for diversity in science.
yeah. Well, the conversation is so important that, thank you very much for asking me and giving me the opportunity to bend your listeners' ears.
Yeah, sure. And yes, before I let you go, I would like to read this one line that you mentioned in your book: "A gendered society gives rise to a gendered brain."
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty much is a great
Take
message.
home message. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gina.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.